For all 30 years of my time on this earth, there has always been the soft accompanying glow of a Matt Groening show to guide me through every phase of life. For the first 10, it was The Simpsons. In many ways, I'd say those early seasons of The Simpsons helped guide the sense of humor I have today, informing it along with the broad parody and slapstick of things like the Naked Gun movies and just about everything Mel Brooks has made. Through the late teenage years, there was Futurama. If Simpsons represented the analog era of my life in the network television when there were only like 40 channels, then Futurama represented the expansion of cable. Of course, I never could watch Futurama because its time kept on changing due to football. And then it was unceremoniously canceled before it was revived back from the dead in the form of several straight-to-DVD movies, brought to Comedy Central, then killed again. And now, in the third decade of my life, there is a new Matt Groening show to define this phase of my existence. And it is Disenchanted. Now, I normally don't do flavor of the minute reviews, or at least I've tried to avoid it, but because of my long history and how much of an impact the style and workings of Matt Groening have had on me, I felt that I had to do something on Disenchanted, because if there's a show I really wanted to like, it was this one. But despite my excitement, despite my curiosity, I couldn't help but find myself disillusioned with Disenchantment.
You gotta love to be gone back it. Love turns into time, don't you grab it.
So the germs of Disenchantment have existed for a very long time. You can see little pieces of it in both The Simpsons and Futurama. Futurama had the Bender's Game movie that was split up into 4 episodes so it could be re-aired on Comedy Central, which was basically the idea of the Futurama cast playing a D&D game and being transmitted to a fantasy world. And The Simpsons has done a lot of medieval-themed episodes, whether they're the kind of out-of-continuity things where they recast Springfield as new characters in a new story, or in the Treehouse of Horror specials. We've seen medieval times depicted in The Simpsons, and we've seen a little bit of it in Futurama. And in a way, it feels like the perfect arc for Matt Groening to finish his career. For one decade to be focused on the modern era, another decade to be focused on the future, and then for his final possible series to focus on the past. So this is something that has obviously been brewing within him for a very long time. And it's also fascinating that he chose to take it to Netflix to represent the new era of television and content creation that is prioritizing streaming services, that is quickly eclipsing the old paradigm. And in a way, if you look at Matt Groening's career, each series has reflected that paradigm. Originally just the network shows, then moving on to more specialized cable Futurama, and now the streaming universe with Disenchantment. And for me, the Matt Groening style is like a comfort food. I've grown up with it for so long that to just see anything in that style is like warm gravy being poured over my brain. Almost with a Pavlovian response, I was excited to check out Disenchantment and ready to potentially love it. I wanted to love it. I really, really did. But the thing that really kind of kills it, it sort of shows how far Matt Groening has fallen out of touch with the general pop culture and what people have been able to do in the sphere of adult animation. Simpsons was once the subversive, edgy show that was pushing boundaries. Moms were pushing against Bart. But as Super Eyepatch Wolf pointed out in his absolutely excellent video detailing the fall of The Simpsons, it eventually morphed as the paradigm shifted, and the shows it was making fun of, the family sitcoms of the 80s, sort of morphed out or became more like The Simpsons, and The Simpsons became more like the status quo. And when you become the status quo, and you're not making fun of the system, and you are part of the system, you basically shear off any of your old edge. And that mode of comedy and storytelling definitely transfers over to Disenchantment. And probably one of the most crippling things is that Bean is just an incredibly boring character with nothing driving her. We've had decades of the, I'm a princess, but I'm not that kind of princess. I'm not a Disney princess, which has been done again and again. And if you ask me personally, I think the nadir came when Shrek introduced it with, oh, Fiona's a princess, but she's a princess who kicks ass and knows Matrix moves. And to the point where, like, even Disney is banking on the anti-princess trope with Enchanted as well as Frozen, then if you're gonna do the whole I'm a princess but I don't want to be a traditional princess kind of feel, then you gotta bring something new to the table. And I was very disappointed to see that Bean doesn't really bring anything to the table except for very sort of standard jokes of being like, oh, I'm a tomboy, I get drunk. But you know what? Fry is kind of a bland character too. Homer is kind of a bland character. If you can have a good supporting cast, then you can compensate for a bland main character. But unfortunately, Bean is accompanied by Elfo and Lucy, and they never rise beyond being anything more than mascots, little props that accompany her. Lucy has only one characteristic, and that's trying to get Bean to do the wrong thing or follow her worst impulses, but that is made completely pointless by the fact that she always follows her worst impulses anyway. So what does it matter if someone tries to goad her if Bean's already gonna make the bad choice anyway? It makes Lucy's presence completely superfluous. And Elfo is just miserable because he's introduced as having only one defining characteristic, and that's being overly happy all the time. But then even that characteristic is completely thrown out the window quickly as Elfo gets into his love-struck relationship with Bean in the will they, won't they romance that will assumingly drive a good portion of the rest of the series. And it's really kind of hard to sell the nice guy Elfo or really get the audience invested in Elfo hooking up with Bean because he never feels like he serves any other purpose than a one-note mascot joke. And that joke isn't even particularly funny, and when he moves away from that joke, he becomes even less funny. And the whole thing kind of just becomes uncomfortable as opposed to, hilarious. Basically, imagine One Piece if Chopper had an unrequited crush on Nami or Robin, and how awkward that would be, with him just sort of like pawing at them desperately. Or, hell, imagine Futurama if Leela had been stalked by Nibbler, and Nibbler just spent entire episodes dry humping her leg in desperation to try and win her affection over. And how awkward that would be for just about everyone. And a great amount of the romantic and narrative tension is focused on Elfo, and it just doesn't hold up. And the series tries to have its cake and eat it too by having self-contained episodes, but also a larger narrative. But in many times, the larger overarching narrative doesn't have many consequences. Like the diplomatic mission to Dankmeyer, where Bean screws up everything, they escape, ruins their alliance, and then everyone's just fine with it after they leave, including the Queen. Which would be fine if it was just an episodic series. Matt Groening obviously wants to dip his toes into the well of larger continuity. But having been raised on a series where he could only do episodic things and make small changes to the characters and settings, doesn't quite have a knack for it. Despite teasing that, oh, there's a great epic story just hanging off to the side, and just wait, there are clues to what the greater meaning of Disenchanted is. We just need to search for them. But there's nothing in the series, at least in this first part of the first season, to really sell us on being invested in anything about any of this. By the time the story gets more serialized, it's sort of too late to make us care, and if this is what you wanted to do initially, you should have done it far earlier in the season. I couldn't find myself caring, except for the fact that I was eating pancakes, and I wanted to finish eating those pancakes, and I had it on, and I watched it for the duration of my pancake eating. Not to mention that you have a lot of contrived scenes that are supposed to be hilarious, but the joke is so obvious without some sort of great punchline that all you can do is just sort of sit there and groan. The best example of this is when Bean has to make her diplomatic speech, and then she gets drunk and ruins it for everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the Honorable Ambassador Tia Beanie, Maria Beanie, De La Rochambeau Drunkowitz.
Isn't this funny? Why aren't you laughing? Why aren't you laughing? This is a fancy event. This is supposed to be a fancy event, and she's ruining it.
This is a fancy restaurant. This is a fancy restaurant.
Ha 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 ha! This is so funny. Why aren't you laughing? Why aren't you laughing?
Why aren't you laughing? Why aren't you laughing?
It's a fancy restaurant.
The series, though, is nice to look at, and it feels like the perfect kind of background noise, like the perfect show to have on when you're doing something else, whether it's cooking or playing a video game. If there was ever something that represented lazy comfort food, it is this. And to that, though, I can sort of appreciate it because I do like comfort food that I can slather all over my brain. And maybe it'll find its footing in the second half of season 1 that's premiering next year. And apparently there's another second season that was already greenlit by Netflix, so we'll be seeing more Disenchantment for the future. But it's funny to think that Pendleton Ward and Adventure Time, who cited The Simpsons as a big influence, would go on to be a better version of Disenchantment than currently Disenchantment is of itself. I'm not a particularly big fan of Adventure Time. I find the sort of cloying sweetness and hipster jokes of the sort of Fred Siebert school of cartoon comedy to be exceedingly off-putting. It is like my kryptonite. My sense of humor will always prefer more biting things like South Park or Rick and Morty. But in this November, as things get colder and fall grows cooler, I can sort of appreciate the sort of warm quality of background noise that Disenchantment has provided. And even if I don't love it as much as I'd like to, I can still see it the same way I see a warm fire on a cold fall evening, and take comfort for that. Also, MVP to Joe DiMaggio for King Zog. He is such a great voice actor, and I kind of love that curmudgeon character. But then again, Joe DiMaggio is a great voice actor who uplifts anything he's involved in. So, props to him, and Zog is the MVP for me of the series. So, is Disenchantment something that you find more engaging than I did? Did you think it was funnier? Do you have theories on how it all comes together? Let me know in the comments down below. And a special thank you to the Pixel Hipster for editing this video. And remember, Lobster is a tennis, but don't you grab it.